What's going on, guys? Wade here. We are out in Alexandria, Minnesota today in Kincaid Cemetery. The unfortunate site of a lot of vandalism. As you can see behind me, we've got a lot of broken headstones. They had a vandal come through here last fall and break some of the oldest monuments that were here in the cemetery. It's a really unfortunate situation. But we're here to work and get some of these restored and train some of the local individuals with the techniques and preservation and see what they can do to get this cemetery back and repaired. I'm out with Deb Viezda, the sexton of the cemetery, and what we were talking about is a lot of the vandalism that occurred here, and I was just hoping that she would share a little bit about what she saw that morning and what the work that they've been doing to restore the cemetery with her staff and community members.
Well, one morning, early morning, one of my employees were here at 6:30. He calls me and I get up here. I honestly had a pit in my stomach.
Yeah.
Like, who could do this? And it was vandals. We saw footprints, and of course it was the old stones.
So you have a few staff members that work here?
I do.
On a volunteer basis, or
No, they're
full-time?
One part-time and one full-time employee.
Usually vandalism is not the biggest problem actually on a national level, but certainly when it occurs, it's a big issue localized. The bigger problem is just slow erosion, things leaning and toppling, and even lawnmower damage. Actually, lawnmowers do more damage, quite confident nationally, than vandalism. But some areas have a lot of vandalism, others have almost none. For the past 20 plus years, I've been concentrating and working in sites like this. About 6 years ago, I created Atlas Preservation, which was a long time vision I had. So we have a couple of marble tablet stones that are snapped, and this was some of the vandalism, and unfortunately one of them is one of the oldest stones here. Tablet stones, originally they were, whatever the region they were from, tended to have localized materials used. As we travel around the country, we see different regions have different materials available, like sandstones in some regions, marble in other. Most of the older stones in America are tablet stones, like 1700s. As time went on, they started to put the tablets into bases, and so they could save stone. They tended to use local material for the bases. This is a piece of a tablet stone that's only 2 inches thick. Sometimes they call this slab stock. Because the stones are so thin, they would put them into a keyway. Bases that these are going into, there's a slot these stones fit into. That base can be called a socket base. It can be called a slotted base. It can be called a keystone. Another thing is that it's quite a sharp edge because it's a recent break. What happens is if this sits outside for a long time, broken, all these edges get really rounded and it continues to deteriorate. So they're quite easy to fix now. And the sooner we fix them, the better.
What got you into being interested in working at a cemetery? There's got to be some kind of story. Why this place, and why did you want to be a sexton? Why did you want to oversee a pretty big operation?
My father-in-law, 50, 60 years ago, dug graves, took care of some cemeteries, and also we have an excavating business. And my husband digs graves at 37 cemeteries in the area. The gentleman that used to take care of this cemetery, that was a sexton, he died suddenly, and they didn't have nobody to take over. So my husband was digging the graves, and I'm familiar with cemeteries. I've been around them for 35 years.
Yeah, you became the supportive wife that said, well, if nobody else is going to do this and you're already out there, we're going to start taking this on as a bigger family project.
Yes, and we do know some of the board members that run the cemetery.
Yeah.
So one afternoon they called us in and asked if we would want to do this. And so my husband digs the graves, he does the heavy work, and I do all the mowing, the weed eating.
That's a great relationship.
My employees, they're awesome. They're very dedicated to the cemetery. I mean, they love it.
So you've spent time then restacking some of the monuments that were vandalized, that had fallen over, and just kind of loosely put them back together?
Yes, well, the ones that we could.
Yep.
We didn't do any of the big ones,
Yep.
but like the smaller ones, we were able to at least put upright. So yeah, we've done quite a bit of work, so.
That's amazing.
Yes.
Awesome.
we could come and just check lightly and see that actually there's nothing holding this. This is that close to toppling. Literally, that's the topple point. If I let go here, it's going over. This is a marble upper portion headstone, a marble upper base, but the lower base is the local regional St. Cloud granite, and that's original. That's all original. There's a practice all over America where the lower bases of monuments in the 1800s were regional. As you get into the granite era, that tends to all go away, and they tend to be consistent, made out of one material.
I'm out with Brittany Johnson from the Douglas County Historical Society, and behind us is the family that really was some of the founders of Douglas County, and they're buried here. They also gave property to start the cemetery, and I was going to ask Brittany to tell us a little bit about the cemetery and this particular family.
Kincaid Cemetery is Alexandria, Douglas County's largest public cemetery. It has the most amount of burials. It also has some of the oldest burials because Alexandria was alongside with Home City, one of the earliest founded cities, settlements in Douglas County. In this section here, we have Margaret Caldwell and the Hicks family. William Hicks came to Douglas County after acquiring the town site in a business deal. A little bit unusual to the rest of Kincaid Cemetery, their graves are located in this raised area, which actually has the cemetery drive around it. William Hicks died really only a few short years into their stay in Douglas County. Teresa, who was blind and really mostly deaf by the end of her life, went on in their legacy, donating a lot of the land, again, part of which becomes Kincaid Cemetery, the courthouse for Douglas County, schools, churches, the earliest parks. One of Teresa's big goals was to make sure that Alexandria in particular was a place for families.
This is another veteran stone. First of all, when they set this too high. There are specifications you could pull up online that depending on the size of the stone, when it was issued, what it should be set. The elevation of a stone like this should be probably about 26 inches above ground. The other thing is they puddled it into wet concrete, and now it's heaved backward significantly. So now what do we do with it? The only solution I know of that's practical is dig a bigger hole and move it with the concrete. Let's just see if we can move this, because a lot of time you're going to find these in concrete, and we don't know how big it is, how deep it is, and this is the reason we don't want to just put big balls of concrete under things indiscriminately. Like I said before, we could raise it, but we can't lower it without taking it out. And taking something out with a big ball of concrete on it is not fun. Yeah, you can go ahead and pack it. You can dump that here, but we got to pack it is more what we're doing now. We get good compaction doing this also sometime with a bar, and if we get a different angle, we could probably get more out of it. You can see how the upper portion is already sliding off of, it's cantilevered past the wash. This area is called a drop wash, which is the angle that it's sloping away. That's a historic effect. All right, what I'm gonna do first is try to give this a little push. And I'm gonna use this big bar, and I'm gonna go down here. I'm gonna get an angle like this, and I'm gonna push it. I already pre-excavated this just so we'd speed up the process. So I'm gonna go low with the block, tighten it up, get a better fulcrum point, and now it moves pretty easily. We've made huge improvements, but it's not far enough. Try to leave the lower block. We'll tip this up, we'll pull this thin one out, and we'll work this other 2x in.
One of the most meaningful parts of this family plot to me is Margaret's stone. Margaret's stone was one of those targeted by vandalism last October, but we were very fortunate that hers actually did not crack. It had been tipped and it laid face down on this curb here. You could actually see boot prints on the back where it had been stomped on. It was very heavy stomping. Margaret has always been a very interesting piece of Douglas County's history to me. Margaret was the Hicks family nanny. She was from Ireland originally. She emigrated to the United States. She, just a few years before her death, was gifted a house by the Hicks family on 6th Avenue in Alexandria as reward for her service, but she never got a chance to have kids of her own. The "well done, thou good and faithful servant," it's a beautiful piece of stonework, and the stone itself being so simple, the design has always been just striking to me and has stood out to me.
The thing about stone is you have to respect it, but never fear it, and you have to know what you're doing. So we're using an epoxy putty. We're going to use 3 materials here. You're not going to see this, okay? This is going to be structural. It's going to make for a really strong repair. We're going to use spacers. When you join monuments, you always put some type of spacer material between them. So you want to define what that space is. We're going to use something called number 2 wedge lead, which is a traditional material been used to join stone for well over 100 years. On the granite, as we showed, they tend to put it around like a ribbon and then put the next piece on top of it. But also they use it on monuments as spacers, and I find it all the time on historic monuments. So I'm going to put the thick part out. It's going to go into the corners, and this is going to define the maximum amount of squeeze out will be 1/8 inch. Can't go past there. This is 1 unit of the epoxy putty. What we're gonna do is make it half it again, so we have 4 pieces about equal. Push it in the centers everywhere, so there's gonna be 4 contact points. They're gonna squeeze out and get wider. We're going to use monument setting compound now. This is the last thing we're going to use. And this is a material that's been used on monuments for about 100 years. It's primarily calcium carbonate. So we're using this in conjunction because this is going to create a seal. It's going to join it together. It can become structural, but technically it's not considered structural. So that's why we're combining it with the epoxy putty for the strength. Now that we mix the epoxy putty, it is hardening, but it is a slow setting putty. So if we used a quick setting, it could already be a problem because it could inhibit this joining. And then I'm going to set it 1, 2, 3 down. It's squeezed pretty quickly. Tiny bit of motion I can still get out of it because it's sitting on so much putty. On a smaller stone, you have to do this more aggressively to get it to seat itself, but that's about it. It doesn't really want to go far.